Okay, welcome back everyone. Next on our agenda, we have both Michael Morrier and Sharon Hynes from the Emory Autism Center. Michael Morrier is the program director for child behavioral interventions, and Sharon Hynes is the program manager for the Behavior Support and Skill Building Program. They will be talking about naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions across the lifespan. Welcome, Michael and Sharon. Thank you for both being here.
Thank you very much. And good morning. I hope you all can hear me. Let me know if you can't. This morning, we want to talk a little bit about naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions and how they can be used across the lifespan. But before we start there, we really want to give just a brief introduction to the Autism Center because we're going to be talking about some of their programs. And we really have three main demonstration programs. We have the Early Emory Center for Child Development and Enrichment, or some of you may know it called Walden Early Childhood Center. We have changed the name a few years ago, so it is now Early Emory. We have the Monarch School Age Education and Transition Program, and you'll be hearing some about how they transition students into adult life later this afternoon when Dr. Matt Siegel talks, which I believe is right after lunch. And then we have the myLIFE adult program, which really serves individuals with autism spectrum disorder from 18 and above. In addition to these programs, we have services that go across the age ranges, and that includes the Behavior Supports and Skill Building Program, which is managed by my co-presenter, Sharon Hynes. We have 2 diagnostic assessment clinics, one for children and one for adolescents and adults. And then we also have medication services, which really work with children and adults. We also do provide training of students entering the field, medical professionals, residents, nursing students. We provide as much hands-on training as possible. And we also do research and program evaluations. Before Sharon and I start, we would like to thank those teams at the Autism Center who've done such a great job of using these NDBI strategies and have shown us really how it can be conducted across the age range. You know, those programs would include the Early Emory program, the Monarch program, myLIFE, and the Behavior Supports program. We should mention that portions of this talk are based on modules, training modules that we are preparing as part of a contract we have with the Georgia Department of Public Health. And with the assistance of our instructional designer, he's helping us really document what we do so that we can use this information in future professional trainings. It is kind of weird doing it this way. Sorry. Just a brief outline of our talk, just so you know, is we're going to go through a brief history of naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions and where they came from, then kind of talk about what are they and what are the core components of them. And then Ms. Hynes will talk about the common features, quality indicators, how NDBIs can support inclusion, and then we'll give some examples of how NDBI can be used across the age range. Increasingly, effective and efficient treatments have been developed since the 1960s, which led to progressively more positive outcomes for individuals with ASD due to these treatment effects. Since the 60s and more recently the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, we've had the ability to really diagnose children at younger and younger ages, which has allowed them to start treatment younger and younger. And research has shown that early intervention using these evidence-based treatments can have a substantial impact on the outcomes of individuals with autism. Early on, treatment was often provided in distraction-free environments or settings that didn't resemble what children were encountering on a day-to-day basis of the natural environment. Using this type of treatment, skills were often broken down into discrete pieces and taught using repeated trials until that behavior was learned. And when these goals were being developed and the teaching strategies used, they weren't really keeping in mind the developmental level of the child or the appropriateness of these goals for the child. For example, a lot of the treatments expected young children to sit at tables and during rote trials for hours on end. or a school-age child might be taught to sustain engagement and only given toys provided typically to toddlers or preschoolers. Although children showed gains receiving this type of treatment, research began to show that there were side effects with this. And these side effects included the children failing to generalize skills into different contexts or with different people. There were also increases in avoidance or escape behavior in the children. They were showing they really did not want to be there enduring these type of treatments. And the children a lot of them ended up becoming dependent on others to prompt the skill rather than use the skill independently when the treatment providers were not there. Again, children showed increase in skills, and we're not saying this was bad, but these side effects often interfered with the children's ability to use them when they needed them outside of those treatment settings. So basically, children would use the skills in the treatment environment, but wouldn't use them in their daily life with their parents at home or with siblings or with peers. Because of this, in the 80s and 90s, there was a shift in the thought of treatment for children with autism, and more emphasis was placed on providing treatment in natural environments and targeting functional skills. In addition, the research during that time began to show that there was a disconnect between the highly structured teaching environments in these traditional treatment delivery systems and the general principles of how children in general learn that was coming out of developmental psychology research. The research was also showing that children with ASD developed along similar paths as typical children, and they were not really developing along different paths. Out of this was born the field of NDBIs, or Naturalistic Developmental Behavioral Interventions. Initially, research showed that early intervention programs that used the components of NDBI resulted in improved outcomes for young children with ASD. But since then, these strategies have gone beyond early intervention and have been shown to be effective for individuals diagnosed across the age range. And we'll be showing how these principles can be applied to different ages, mostly the early childhood, and then adults later on in this talk. So what are NDBIs? I mean, a naturalistic developmental behavioral intervention is an evidence-based procedure. That is, they're interventions that are supported through research and that come from the fields of ABA, or applied behavior analysis, and developmental psychology. It's really a merger of these two fields into one that have produced the NDBI. We will go into this in more detail later, but in brief, NDBIs occur in natural settings, use everyday cues, interactions, and reinforcement. Problem behaviors or proven behavioral strategies are often used to teach developmentally appropriate and functional skills, as well as the foundational skills needed to build more complex behaviors and skills. And some of the research, which we'll go into later, actually shows that you may see a reduction in problem behaviors using these skills across the age range. You know, in some, NDBIs start with teaching functional skills based on the learner's individual developmental level and work towards their chronological age. I should just make a note here, during this talk, we will be talking about learners instead of clients or children or adults, because really we are all learners across the age span, and we all continue to be learners and really should look at everyone as learning and not as a client per se. So I talked a lot about the natural environment. So what is the natural environment? It really is learning in the natural environment is a foundational element of NDBIs. And so you really need to know, how do you define these natural environments? The natural environment is any environment in which the learner participates or has access to in their everyday lives. This could include their homes, their childcare centers, their schools, a doctor's office, work, community, including church, grocery stores, you know, any place like that. So these are environments that help facilitate opportunities for learning and generalizing functional skills. The natural environment could also be a place that the learner would like to access in order to participate within their community or engage in an activity of interest, but they may not be doing so already. And so one of the goals is to provide that opportunity so that they can learn the skills and how to access that environment. Natural environments can lead to increased opportunities for meaningful engagement in social interactions. These environments enable the learner to participate in enjoyable play or leisure activities, because as adults, we really would consider it leisure activities and not play, as well as familiar daily routines using a variety of materials. We don't necessarily have to bring materials into these environments, but we're going to use what's there and really follow their interest, which allows these natural environments, allow the learner to use self-help and adaptive skills that will eventually lead them to more independent lives. So some core components, there's 3 core components of NDBI, and we'll touch on each of them. The first is teaching goals. So from the start, an NDBI is used to target skills that can be used within and across developmental areas, including communication, social interactions, play and leisure skills, cognitive skills, and motor skills. So these learned skills are going to build on each other, starting on a lower level and moving on to more complex. In addition, behaviors that lead to more additional learning of additional skills without specifically being taught, or what we call generative learning, are going to be emphasized. So these are skills that once we teach the learner how to perform those skills, they're going to be able to access other skills or do other behaviors without directly being taught. Behaviors that come into this category are things such as imitation, reciprocal engagement, joint attention. And those are considered generative learning because they all lead to increasingly more complex behavior. For example, we can teach a toddler to imitate a simple motor movement, which can eventually lead to a junior high student imitating his peers on the basketball court. So it's something where once you teach a child to imitate, you don't have to teach them every time that they imitate. They learn it, and it's going to keep going with them and growing with them as they go on. With an NDBI, you teach in the context where the learner is going to need the skills. In other words, you're teaching skills that are meaningful and functional to that learner. This means the skills are practical, useful, and helpful for the learner, and they can be applied immediately to their environment in a variety of real-world situations or real-life settings. Functional skills can lead to independence across the areas of communication, behavior, social interaction, and daily living. But also acquiring these functional skills can replace unwanted behaviors and often can prevent behavior problems from developing in the first place. NDBI enables the learner to use and generalize skills across people, environments, and social contexts because you're capitalizing on their natural curiosity, their motivations, and their interest. Generalization occurs when the skill that is taught is used outside of that specific treatment setting with different people in different places and will even be used after the treatment stops. So focusing on teaching functional skills with NDBI, you can lead to greater access to independence, increased engagement, and social interactions with others. Individuals learn to respond to a variety of cues and to provide responses that are meaningful at that time and with the individuals they're interacting. In other words, NDBI targets behaviors where those skills are most valuable to the learner. Janot, McNeary, and Mengeres summarized this best when they said, in NDBI treatment planning, skill areas are prioritized based on what skill will have the greatest impact on later development and quality of life for the individual and family and are taught in a developmentally appropriate sequence. So the next core component of NDBI is the treatment delivery. With NDBI, you're going to use the learner's ongoing routines and daily activities as the tool for teaching, whether that be the family's ongoing natural routines or the routines of the adult on going to work, going to school, going grocery shopping. You're going to use those activities with them for the learner. In NDBI, the learner's interest in the activity or item is used to teach the skill where they're going to need that skill. And we're going to keep saying that kind of over and over again and talk about the functionality of these skills and that it's going to be promoted because you're using their interest, teaching it where they need it, and you don't have to teach it separately and then program for them to use it in the next environment. NDBI does operate on the principles that natural scenarios and interests create powerful teaching opportunities, and these opportunities should be captured as teachable moments. I know yesterday, Dr. Jennifer Staplewax talked about teachable moments in some of these NDBI components as well. And so we may be repeating a little of what she said, but I think it's really important to emphasize that fact that you really want these interests and these scenarios to be seen as a teachable moment. So when they're showing interest, you're using that to teach the skills that have been targeted for that individual. These teachable moments can be used to teach an infinite number of skills that is individualized for each learner's real unique developmental level and the targeted goals. It's not going to be the same for everybody, and we'll show some of that later on. Also, since the individual is learning through activities they enjoy, they're more likely to cooperate. And in fact, they may think they're just having fun or engaging in a typical social interaction. Because the teaching episode is initiated by the learner based on what they're interested in, they're more likely to quickly learn the skill and be able to use it in other situations. For example, for some of us, when we were in college and you had to take an elective based on your interest in art, along with that required statistics class that you had no interest in, you were probably more engaged and open to learning in that art class. For me, it probably would have been the statistics class over the art class, but for most people I know, they're not really interested in statistics. I know there's some people on this call, on this webinar, that statistics would have been the preferred class over art as well. But in general, you know, the same principle about that is we're going to use when teaching individuals with autism. We all do better when we're doing things we like and using an interest we prefer. Using NDBI enables the learner to generalize target behaviors from the start because their motivation and the naturally changing cues in the environment are what signals them to engage in this behavior. That is, they don't need to rely on external cues from another person to tell them what is expected at that time, which can lead to prompt dependency. This can also occur as a side effect when the learner learns to wait for a prompt from someone else in order to engage in a desired behavior. And we have seen that a few times for kids that have gone through a more structured, traditional ABA program, and then when they're put into a situation where they have to interact with peers, they've been taught to really listen to what the adult is telling them to do. And so a child comes up to them and asks them to play, they look to get permission from the adult, and then they come back, and by that time their peer is gone because they're not going to wait around for an adult to give permission to play. Within NDBI, it is important to provide instruction in the natural environments, since these are the places, settings, and routines in which the learner will use the skills being targeted on a day-to-day basis. By using natural environments, the learner is taught to respond to the environmental cues to use the behavior that will lead to access to reinforcers in that environment. Environmental cues, just so you know, or not really sure what they are things that naturally cue the learner to do the skills. These cues occur naturally in the environment, and it's not something that you have to add in later. They're different from the artificial prompts we might add in to provide extra support to hint or remind the learner to perform that skill. In addition, natural environments provide increased opportunities to practice functional skills where those skills are needed, which can speed up skill acquisition, fluency, and generalization. And then the last core component of NDBI is instruction. As we said in the beginning, NDBI uses evidence-based behavioral teaching strategies that are embedded into the learner's daily routines and activities. We don't have time to go into the details of each of these strategies or all the strategies that can be used, but some examples that are commonly used with NDBI in order to support learner in mastering target skills include modeling, prompting, shaping, chaining, and differential reinforcement. When using those, the learner's reinforcement for performing the skill is access to an enjoyment with the activity or item of interest. So the learner's interest becomes the reinforcer and their motivation to perform the target behavior, which increases the likelihood that behavior will occur in the future. By using the interest of the learner to teach them how to gain access to what they want and need through functional skills, you can prevent unwanted or maladaptive behaviors such as tantrums or aggressions from occurring. For example, consider someone who engages in the behavior falling on the floor and screaming because they're hungry. In the past, they may have previously been reinforced for this behavior by gaining access to the food they wanted to calm them down. In this case, that learner has really learned that tantrums are an effective way of communicating their desire to eat or their desire for food. Instead, you can use NDBI to teach them to communicate their needs in a more functional way. This could mean that at dinner time, they're taught to verbally say or sign or hand a picture of or point to the pizza in order to get a slice of pizza for dinner. The next time, the learner may be supported to ask for 2 pieces of pizza and then prompted to say why he wants the pizza, something like, because I like it, and then share 1 slice with his sister who also likes pizza. This learner is being taught to request, provide rationales, math skills, and social learning all within that 1 teaching episode. When they learn that they're being reinforced for this functional communication instead of the tantrum, they're more likely to use those behaviors in the future to get their needs met, both during dinner time at home and in other similar situations like dinner time at a restaurant or at a friend's house and grandmother's house. In addition, because those other skills are taught together within 1 preferred activity and with 1 preferred item, they not only learn the individual skill of requesting, but they learn how to use it together with all those other skills in a more functional manner. This prevents the need for us as providers, which could include parents, teachers, therapists, to teach each skill individually using a discrete manner and then teach them how to integrate those skills all together. Okay, so those are the core components and some of the history. And now Sharon Hynes will talk about the common features of NDBI.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when we're looking at the common features of NDBI or that go across NDBI, there are many common features, and each program emphasizes and uses these components to varying degrees. Many of these components we've already discussed. Due to time, we'll focus on the 2 main features that really distinguish NDBI from other autism treatments. The first feature is that all NDBI programs are based on the principles of applied behavior analysis, or ABA. So by looking at the antecedent or what comes before the behavior, looking at the behavior itself, and the consequences of the behavior, or what happens right after the behavior has occurred, instructors are also able to provide feedback to the learner during the teaching session. Some programs put more emphasis on what comes before the behavior, others emphasize the consequences. However, all provide some sort of feedback to the learner. This feedback could include additional prompts to perform the correct behavior, as well as reinforcement in the form of access to their wants and needs. It also teaches the learner when and how to respond, thus increasing motivation to perform the behavior in the future. So the second feature we want to focus on is that all NDBI programs use developmentally based intervention strategies and sequences to guide goal development, which is individualized for each person. So the interventions can be based on results of standardized assessments as well as program-specific assessments, but all assess and track developmental levels and skills in some defined way. So when we say developmentally based interventions, we mean the interventions to be used and the skills to be targeted are based on the learner's age, their current behavioral repertoire. For example, a 3-year-old who can identify numbers and rote count might then be taught to count with 1-to-1 correspondence to identify how many pieces of candy they want. Whereas a 17-year-old learner who can identify numbers and rote count might need to learn how to conduct basic addition and subtraction, and as well as identify money in order to pay for candy at the store. So those are some of the the key features across the different NDBI programs that we look at, the 2 main features. Another thing with NDBI, it really is ideal for supporting inclusion. So since the interventions based in NDBI focus on natural environments, learners are provided with opportunities to learn alongside their same age peers, their community members, family members, just while engaging in everyday routines and activities. And in addition, opportunities to learn age-appropriate skills are increased by being surrounded by learning models all the time. So with NDBI, learners gain skills through practice and more normalized interactions that teach how to both initiate interactions to others as well as respond to interactions from others. So this really leads to a more balanced give and take social interaction when learning. So instead of all of sort of the directions coming from the adult might be initiating, the child responds, the adult responds, or vice versa. And it really leads to a back and forth, more reciprocal social interaction. So looking at NDBI across the age ranges, as we sort of mentioned earlier, initial research with NDBI supported its use with early intervention. So early NDBI programs were specifically designed for toddlers with autism spectrum disorder, and published evidence supported use for early intervention. Since then, NDBI has expanded from a focus on natural family routines and activities to more recent descriptions of NDBI for older learners, including adults on the autism spectrum. Although the context and treatment goals evolve as a learner ages, the treatment methodology remains the same. Because NDBI builds on a learner's current abilities, new treatment targets will be building and expanding upon previously learned skills. So it's important to remember that precursor skills should be taught even to older learners if it is not already in their repertoire before moving on to more complex behaviors that rely on these sort of early skills. So for example, it is commonly thought that teaching joint intention really is a goal of early childhood. But if needed, NDBI strategies can be used to teach the skill in older individuals as well. The materials and context, of course, will be different, but the same methods will apply. So here's a chart we have of sort of general teaching targets that go across age ranges and developmental areas. So looking at communication, social skills, engagement or leisure skills, adaptive or self-help behaviors. In the early childhood setting, this might be sort of a typical trajectory and different goals that you can target across the age range. So maybe beginning by just responding to another person's voice, babbling, learning words, increasing the vocabulary, simple gestures, learning simple receptive language, joint attention, as I mentioned earlier. And then moving on as they get older, building upon that, learning, expanding their vocabulary to more complex words, beginning to have more extensive conversations, complex receptive or non behavior, so following multi-step directions, novel directions, using more integrated nonverbal behavior, more subtle nonverbal behavior. When you're a young child, your nonverbal might be really exaggerated. As you get older, you've got to kind of tone it down a little bit. And again, expanded pragmatic language. And then as we get to adolescents and adults, again, just building on your conversational skills and becoming more and more complex in all of the behaviors you learned earlier on. In the social area, we might start off with simple imitation, beginning to initiate to others or respond to others' initiations. It might just be as simple as showing awareness that there are other people in your environment. Again, moving on to reciprocal interactions with others. When we get to school age, we really start developing friendships at that time. That requires a lot of varied social interactions and social skills. We start building empathy. As young children, they're sort of the center of their world. And as they get older, they have to realize, I need to see things from other people's perspectives and show empathy and understand their point of views. Understanding social conventions, and again, getting more and more complex as they get to adolescents and adults. Engagement, so just beginning skills. How do you even play with a toy? Functional play, starting to learn some pretend play through dramatic play. You are starting to learn independence in your play skills, but it's somewhat limited. You're often relying on other people or sharing your play skills with other people. As they get older, becoming more independent. they really start honing their interests, starting to figure out, what kinds of things are important to them, what do they like doing. And as they reach adulthood, fostering those interests. How do I develop a hobby? How do I find other people and places where I can engage in this hobby? How do I do that without being directed by other people? Adaptive skills, of course, young children learning to feed themselves, dress themselves, toilet training, all those basic skills. And then moving on to more independence, self-care, community safety, starting to learn self-management skills. And then as adolescents or adults, really understanding self-management and how to sort of regulate what they're doing on their own, becoming more independent, learning things like money management, independent living or working, things like that. So those are just some really general examples of ways that you can sort of target different developmental areas and build on each skill as the individuals get older. Again, these are just really general areas, and there's so many more goals that we can talk about. But if we want to break it down even further, we can look at, social skills with peers. How do you do that across home, school, and community? What are the types of things that you can target there? So in early childhood, so again, initiating your wants and needs, responding to others, things you need to know in order to interact with other people. So again, becoming more complex, expanding the sort of the world of who you're interacting with outside of your family. Adolescents and adults, again, increasing your complex reciprocal interactions. Building upon what you can do with your friends and your family, but then your partner, roommates, other things as you get older. All of these, require the same sort of things. You're initiating, you're responding, but how you do that as you get older becomes much more complex. So in school, we might be imitating peer models. As they get a little bit older, not just imitating them, but working cooperatively, back and forth, give and take in an interaction. And then learning how to adjust your behaviors, not only kind of on what you've learned, but off the cues from other people, not just environmental cues, but what are other people showing you? Are they showing a facial expression that says, I think you're standing too close to me, you need to step back, understanding to adjust your behavior based off the social cues from other people, such as your coworkers or people out in the community. And then again, in the community, really looking at early on, many kids just they need to learn how to just share space with others. That can be a real challenge for young children with autism. And so learning how to do that in a way that can become comfortable and reinforcing, and where they can, find that there's fun things that they can do in that environment. And then as they get older, having them be actively participate in less structured activities. So this might be, going out and joining a t-ball team or a karate class or something that they're going to have to work cooperatively with other individuals. And then as they get older, adolescents and adults, again, independence and activities of mutual interests with others, such as hobbies and things like that. And I think sometimes we forget about this for individuals on the spectrum. As we get older, we all like to seek out things that interest us and be with people that have the same interests. And we want to make sure that our older learners are able to have that ability to do that for themselves as well. So those are different ways that you can kind of teach goals across different developmental levels and increasingly complex skills. So Michael, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can build NDBI in different age programs. So Michael is going to talk a little bit more about the Early Emory program now.
Okay, and so Early Emory, some of you may know and some of you may not, it is an inclusive program for children 12 months through pre-K, and it embeds ABA within regular preschool activities. So we're really looking at the preschool as the natural environment for children at that age group, because not every child is staying at home. Parents have to work and they have to have somewhere to put their child. So, how can we use regular preschool activities so it looks just like a regular preschool, but it also helps us not teach skills in isolation. So if you're learning how to say hi and bye to your mom or dad when they drop you off at school, you're also going to have to say hi and bye to your teachers when they come in and out of the room or when you enter an activity. You're going to have to learn how to share space, how to share materials, how to request snack items from your teachers, from your peers. You know, it's kind of all of that, using those skills that are needed in order to be successful or participate in a preschool program. We also take our treatment goals, we identify them from not only direct standardized assessments, but also descriptive assessments. So watching the child in the classroom, what are they doing? What are they, where are they having areas where they may need more support and more assistance? We've actually also spent a lot of time really looking at what do typical children do at certain ages and using that as the benchmark for treatment goals. You know, so we're teaching a 2-year-old to act like a 2-year-old. We're teaching a 4-year-old to act like a 4-year-old. It's not that we're saying like, oh, let's do it this way and that type of thing. Because it may be that we teach kids, and we used to do this all the time, where we taught kids skills that actually made them stand out from other people. You know, we taught kids to give eye contact 100% of the time. But what happens is other kids didn't want to interact with them because we taught them to stare at them. And, you know, it made kind of people uncomfortable. So we had to find out, how often do people give eye contact? You know, what is the kind of range there? So that we know, and we're teaching kids, again, to kind of fit in with the environment that they're using. We also target goals for social communication engagement following the developmental sequence, as I said, of the same age peers, and we really get family input to align these goals with what's going on with their homes and their community activities and routines and what is functional in their environment. Those of you that have heard me speak before have probably heard this story, but when I first started working with toddlers, we had a lot of families come up to us and kind of sit us down and say, we want you to teach our child how to ride a tricycle. And I was kind of like, well, you know, he's not really talking and he's not really aware of other kids. So I'm not sure that's the most important skill for him to be learning right now. And the parents came back and said, you know, on our cul-de-sac, every day after dinner, everyone in the neighborhood comes out and they ride bikes together. They ride their tricycles. The parents get to talk to each other. The kids get to talk to each other. And my child can't participate because they don't know how to ride their tricycle. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. That is a good goal to teach them. It's going to open up other opportunities, and it's going to be, again, done in that natural setting of the cul-de-sac and teaching the child to use those skills when they need it with the other people. We also do a lot of family coaching. And we also have just started using the Brooke Ingersoll's Project Impact with families that are entering the program to really get them to really know how to use these skills and generalize them to home and the community. We do, as much as possible, try to do those skills in our center just because it's more cost effective, but we will go to the homes for certain issues. You know, if there are things like the child's having a bedtime routine that just isn't working for the family, okay, we can't do that in our center. So we'll have to go to the home. We also try to go to the home at least every 6 months so parents can ask us questions. How are they doing? How do they put this strategy we've taught them into their home environment? Since COVID-19, it's been a little more difficult trying to do it through Zoom, which I mean, all of you are probably struggling with now, providing that coaching. Some of it is very easy. And then others, it's kind of like, oh, I need my hands on that child in order to do it. So, you know, trying to really balance that. But we're really trying to take those NDBI principles, using the natural environment, using children's interest, using peers, monitoring progress so that we know when we're making success and when we're not, and what we have to do to change. So, I mean, one thing that is kind of overriding with NDBI that's not specifically stated anywhere is the kind of belief that if an individual or a learner is not making progress, how do you change what you're doing in order to give them the support they need? It's not that they're doing something, it's what you're doing is not working for that individual's unique needs and that individual's unique interests. So that's how early Emory kind of does the NDBI and incorporates it into our program. And now Sharon's going to talk about the myLIFE adult program. We're kind of going to opposite ends of the spectrum here, but she'll talk a little about that.
Okay, so, as we mentioned, there really is a lot of information regarding NDBI programs for young kids. So we just wanted to take a minute to talk about how the myLIFE program is incorporating this into their program for adults, and what NDBI might look like for adults. So the myLIFE program uses the Emory campus and the community as their program setting. So they have neurotypical peer volunteers who are the same age as the group members with ASD, and through group activities, myLIFE works on skills within the 7 areas outlined on their wellness wheel. So they work on social wellness, emotional wellness, intellectual wellness, physical wellness, spiritual wellness, environmental wellness, and financial wellness. And so those are really broad categories, but what they target under them is really specific for each client. So again, the wheel informs the areas to be targeted, but each area may mean something different to the individual member. So that is, everyone may be working on social goals, but goals are targeted, the specific goals are targeted for each member based on their unique developmental profile. So this program, what they're doing falls under NDBI for the following reasons. So the activities that they do are determined based off the preferences of the group members, and they're considered common activities for that age group. The activities are provided in the natural environment and target functional skills. The skills that they target are targeted across settings, are targeted across activities, and across people, which really promotes generalization or the use of those skills in different environments than where they were specifically taught. So the targeted skills are chosen based off the adult's age, developmental level, and the interests of the learners and all the group members. So by practicing the skills in the natural environment, they are learning to respond to environmental cues, and they do receive natural reinforcement for their responses or their behaviors. So the natural environment for myLIFE include an on-campus apartment as well as other campus and community settings. So for example, to learn how to ride a bus, they practice on an actual bus. But they're not just riding the bus for the sake of riding a bus. They may be going to the store to shop or the student center to eat lunch. At the student center, they can practice paying or having conversations with their peers. So you can really see how these skills are not taught in isolation, but are rather designed to be taught in a natural sequence and where those skills are naturally needed. The group members have an active voice in what skills will be targeted, making those skills both important and functional for them. So another example might be the group is playing a game of Uno in order to target social skills. So the overall goal for the group at that time is working on social skills. But through that activity, they're going to define or target those skills based off each individual's level, each learner's level. So they can teach things like initiating, asking a follow-up question, having a conversation back and forth about the game or on a variety of topics, taking turns, or even just sharing space. So you can see how they kind of incorporate sort of goals that are developmentally appropriate or on target for each individual person, but they're also doing it in a way through ongoing activities in the natural environment, all those things that you would find in an NDBI program. So these are really just two examples of how the myLIFE team uses NDBI to target skills for adults with autism. Let's see. So although NDBI was originally designed for young children, we do know that it can be a powerful and effective teaching method across the age ranges. And I'm just going to talk about this briefly, but one last thing we wanted to mention is the quality indicators of NDBI programs. So we already talked about the common features and the core components that need to be in place in order to be an NDBI program. But those features alone are not enough to ensure that a program is going to be effective or even of good quality. As we all know, the quality and effectiveness of programs really can vary. And so when quality indicators are in place, along with common features and core components, will be more likely to produce effective outcomes. So these quality indicators are evidence-based, and they're clearly defined measures so we can track the effectiveness of our programs. And these indicators include defined procedures to use within the program, treatment fidelity measures to ensure procedures are being done correctly, individualized programs for the learners and their families, clearly defined treatment goals, and ongoing progress tracking of the learner's development. And lastly, quality staff training to make sure staff are implementing the procedures correctly. You know, obviously you can have the best program in the world, but if it's not being done right, you know, your outcomes are not going to be what you want them to be. So those are some of the things in addition to the core components that we would look for in a quality NDBI program. So that's all we have for today. But before we end, we did want to just say thank you to the Centers for Leadership and Disability for hosting this important event. We are very impressed on how you made the switch from the online, in-person to the online so quickly. And we really appreciate your efforts in doing so. Thank you.
Thank
All
you so much.
We've also, if you had wanted more information, we have some resources that you can find at the end of our slide. One is a book that has been recently published, and one is the original article that really describes NDBIs and what incorporates it, and kind of this presentation has been kind of a summary of those two sources mostly. Thank you all for listening.
Okay, great. Thank you both for your presentation. That was great. Just so everyone who's watching knows, we will be asking all the presentations that you see today for their slides. So you are able to see them afterwards. And that will be mentioned in the chat as well. So we have a couple of questions. First one here for Michael Morrier specifically. Considering the long waiting time for early identification and intervention, do you have thoughts on psychoeducational training for parents on NDBI while they are waiting for a formal assessment? Even if a family does not qualify for services, they may be dealing with challenging behaviors that can be addressed while waiting for assessment qualification.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we should make clear too is for all of this, a diagnosis does not determine service. I mean, it does determine services, but it shouldn't determine services. So really, if a family needs strategies on how to incorporate some of this, I think we do need to work with that family on how to provide that. Now, I know funding is related to services, and so, you know, how can you do that type of thing? I know some of the interventions for toddlers that are out there are geared more towards kids at risk for a diagnosis and doesn't need a specific diagnosis. But the strategies, since we're looking at the individual learner and what skills they're coming in with and what is important to the families and that individual, we should be able to provide these services that way. They're, you know, and incorporate it into their regular family routines to help them do some of this. We would have to work with the family and the individual and the program to really figure out how can we provide this in a way that's going to be meaningful while they're waiting to get the diagnosis, which could then access more of the funding to help them pay for these type of services, at least in Georgia. And really, depending on their age, if the age is like under 3, they could always contact their early intervention system, because they're not specifically looking for a diagnosis, but they just need to have documentation that children are presenting with developmental delays, whether it be across areas, within areas, and they have a certain criteria, but a diagnosis specifically is not needed for under 3.
And I'll add, Michael, that, you know, when we're looking at these sorts of treatments, these treatments are not specific to autism. It's, you know, these are effective for children, for all children, even typically developing children, but for children that are showing delays or that need some additional support, it's not specific for autism.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Where can folks get more information about NDBI?
There is more information now on the internet than ever before. But basically, if you're looking at the slide now, the top reference, the book, Naturalistic Developmental Behavioral Interventions for Autism Spectrum Disorder, is a really good resource for individuals, where it goes through kind of the history of it, where it came from, what the core components are, all that. But it also then breaks it into how can you use NDBI to teach specific skills like communication. Let me pull up the table of context here while you ask that. So it has, how do you empower parents? How do you select skills? How do you foster inclusion? Motivational strategies, using these strategies across the age range. So targeting communication, social and play, supporting behavior, using it in schools. And so it's really a good kind of overview of how you can use this across the different ages and within different programs.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question. In this approach, what percentage of ABA is applied?
That's going to really vary on the program or the program that you're doing. So there are different models that are considered NDBI, geared towards, again, mostly toddlers with autism, but could be preschoolers and even older kids, like the Project Impact, the Early Emory program. There's the Early Start Denver model. There's just different programs like that. And each of them are going to be looking at it a little differently. So some are going to be more behavioral, but base their goals off of a child's development, where others are going to be a little more relaxed on that. So as Sharon was saying, some programs are going to look heavily on how do we set up the environment and how do we kind of look at what happens before the behavior and teach that way. Others are going to look at the consequence and what do you do once the behavior occurs. So it's going to be varying between programs, but all of them have some aspect of ABA in them.
Great, thank you. Next question is NDBI accessible only through Emory's early intervention program? Is there someone working on NDBI for a 10-year-old, for example?
NDBI is incorporated in different providers are going to be doing NDBI in different ways and for different ages. It's not just an Emory program. It is something that can be accessible. I know like the Marcus Autism Center and Jennifer Staple-Wax, who talked yesterday, uses a lot of NDBI out in the community and using that. Matt Siegel and his team and our Education and Transition Services program uses NDBI to various degrees in schools and in the community. And so it's kind of out there. Sharon's behavior support program works with individuals across all ages and really uses these principles in order to do that. So it's not just an Emory program. It's just, if it's something you want, you just should ask your providers, how much do they use NDBI strategies within their programs, and do they know what they are, and how can they get some training on them. So it is applicable to all ages, as we showed, but it's going to vary based on the training that the providers have received.
Okay, wonderful. Next question. As a general pediatric practice manager, we need to be educated as to how we can better meet our patients' needs, especially while waiting for a diagnosis and before family starts receiving services. I guess that's more of a comment than a question. Let's see. What is the staff to student ratio at Early Emory, and what is the ratio of disabled students to non-disabled? What assessments are used to guide instruction when using NDBI?
At Early Emory, each of our classrooms, I should say we have 4 classrooms, a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 4-year-old classroom. In each classroom, 1/3 of the children have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and 2/3 are neurotypical peers. And then depending on the age of the kids in the class, depends on the staff ratio. So we try to go from a 1 to 3 in our toddler class to a 1 to 6 in our pre-K classroom. So we try to fade out adult support as they get older, because once they go into kindergarten and elementary school and beyond, they're going to have less adults around to really support them. So how can we teach them to kind of learn from their peers, as Sharon was saying, that kind of imitation skills? How can we start teaching that from the beginning so that they have that as they go on? Is that the only question about early Emory, or was there another one?
I think that covered it.
Okay, and if I can just make a comment on the pediatric practice. One of the things I think is important for all of us who provides training to people who will eventually go out into the medical field, whether it be, nurses, pediatricians, family practice providers, psychiatrists, however, is when we're providing training on not only how do you identify and talk to parents about the diagnosis or how to get it, is trying to provide them something to do so that they can show the parents something to do based on those challenges or those areas of need that their child is displaying. So it's not just like, oh, we think he may have autism, you have to wait a year to get into this program, but here's some way you could build language for him. Here are ways you could promote social interactions. And I think as training programs, all of us at universities who are engaged in that professional development really need to focus on that as well. It's important to know how to diagnose and what to look for, but also what do you do, because we know there are so many waiting lists out there.
Great, thank you. All right, next question for you, Michael. Some joint attention medicated learning studies indicate the key function of caretakers following a child's lead at improved functions. How does utilizing preservative interests as a naturalistic reward play into the NDBI framework?
Using their preservative interests are, well, there's a couple of ways you can use that as the reward within an NDBI program. Some of it is going to depend on how kind of I don't want to say interfering, but like how much does it take away from learning other things? So like with adults, a lot of adults have or even school-age kids have an interest in anime and become really engaged with anime. So how can you use that interest to expand other things, like a social group where they can join an anime club where they're going to have to be interacting with people, but it's all about their topic. How can you use that interest to really embed things? So like we have kids that really like green things, and so how can we use that interest? So we may have snacks that are green so that they want to come over to snack, but in order to gain access to that interest, they're going to have to request the snack. We may use green things in art so that the kids, in order to, again, use their green interest, they're going to have to be doing the art activity. So there's different ways you can do it and use those interests within NDBI. And there's no real like set way to say use it this way. It's all going to depend on the learner, what the interest is and how you can use it. Someone who really has a perseveration on, say, McDonald's French fries is kind of a little harder to incorporate into a program. Because as we all know, once you get them and they get cold, they're kind of nasty. So you want them, warm. So, we have done things where if that's what a kid's interest is, we will send a staff member to McDonald's to get fries right before snack time or right before lunchtime or something like that, so that we're using that interest. But it's, so it's going to depend on the interest. It's going to depend on the activity and kind of what the goals are you're trying to teach at that time.
Wonderful, thank you. An article you mentioned earlier, the article on NDBI quality indicators by Stammer and colleagues, where is that published?
That is actually a chapter in the Naturalistic Developmental Behavioral Interventions book.
All right, great, thank you. All right, another question. Are there training opportunities for teachers for this intervention, specifically how to implement in the classroom setting?
Yes, there are. And it's really going to depend on the age of the program. And I don't want to just, make this an ad for the Autism Center, but, for early childhood, it is, we have trained teachers at early Emory or through the behavior supports program. Our school age program, education and transition program goes into schools and trains teachers on how to use strategies like this. So it's really going to depend on what age they are and where they can go. But if someone's interested, they can always contact the Emory Autism Center and we can figure out the best way to serve them and give them other resources if something that we're providing is not something that they're able to access at that time.
All right. Next one, is there research on NDBIs used in that myLIFE adult program?
The myLIFE program is beginning to do research on their effectiveness. They have really spent the last many years, I don't even know how many, developing a program and really trying to figure out, and I should put a shout out to Tony Thomas, who's really led this effort and really looked at, and it's really, she started her career at early Emory or Walden at the time, and really when she moved into adults was how can you take these NDBI strategies and apply them to adults? And she spent a lot of time really figuring that out, but also working on how do you meet the unique needs of the individuals. Now, they did have last year a summer pilot program where individuals with autism, I believe it was 6, spent 3 weeks on the Emory campus during the summer in apartments, and they really used a lot of these strategies on identifying goals for them during that the participants during that 3 weeks, measuring those. And they did just recently publish a paper on that and kind of how they measured that and how they did that. So they're beginning to come out with research on that program. It's just they really needed to, they were trying to develop their model. And now that they have kind of a model, they're going to be able to do more research on that.
Great, thank you so much. That was our last question.